A Course in
What?
with Cynthia Morgan.
Hey, course friends. Welcome to A Course in What? I'm Cynthia Morgan, and this is a podcast in which I read and discuss the text of A Course in Miracles. And A Course in What is a free weekly podcast that comes out every Tuesday. We are on episode 26, and thank you so much for joining me today. I have a couple of announcements. The first is that on September 30th at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'm going to be on Dr. Gary Penn's podcast called Breaking Through. And I'll have that information up on my website and on the Facebook page, A Course in What. And you can also go to his website, drgarypenn.com, and listen or link to it there. And he will also archive that episode. So if you can't listen to it live, you could always go to that link and listen to it at your convenience at another time, if you're even interested. I would imagine that I'll be talking about hypnosis and the unconscious mind because he's a psychologist. And let's see. Also, the Facebook page for A Course in What, as I just mentioned, is up and running now. And some of you have joined it, so thank you. I've been checking you out, and it's a great place for us to join together as a community. And you can ask questions there, leave comments, correct me, anything that you want to do. You can join that A Course in What Facebook page at facebook.com/A Course in What. Also, I meant to mention on the last episode, the meaning of the Last Judgment, episode 25, that there's a section in the workbook on page 455 called What is the Last Judgment? It's question number 10. If you've done the workbook lessons, you notice that interspersed throughout those lessons, there are questions and answers. And anyway, if you're interested in reading more about that idea of the Last Judgment, it's there, question 10 on page 455. All right, so let's get to our reading today. We're starting a whole new chapter. Chapter 3, The Innocent Perception. Section 1, Atonement without Sacrifice. And in our reading for today, we can see that Jesus is continuing his reinterpretation or explanation of traditional Christian themes like the Last Judgment, because here we're going to talk about the crucifixion, atoning without sacrifice. So if we look at the title of this chapter, The Innocent Perception, we see that it's the opposite of the ego's perception, which is guilt. The section title, Atonement Without Sacrifice, is the opposite of what Christianity teaches, that we are guilty and that we must sacrifice and suffer to atone for those very real sins. So we'll begin with paragraph 1, sentence 1. A further point must be perfectly clear before any residual fear still associated with miracles can disappear. So the last chapter, you may recall, dealt a lot with fear and talked about miracles. So this sentence is sort of a continuation of that and eases us into this conversation. It's as if he's saying, there's one more thing that needs to be cleared up before you can be miracle workers. Sentence 2, the crucifixion did not establish the atonement, the resurrection did. So as you know by now, I'm certainly not an expert on Christianity. In my very limited understanding, the crucifixion did not establish the atonement is a correction of that Christian idea that the crucifixion did establish the atonement. So God punished his only son, Jesus, for the sins of humanity. And through that sacrifice, we were then made free. And here he's turning everything right side up again, as he did in the Last Judgment, and saying Christianity has it wrong, basically. The resurrection established the atonement, meaning the resurrection in your mind of who you are, the acceptance of your truth as an innocent child of God establishes the atonement. 3. Many sincere Christians have misunderstood this, meaning they misunderstood that the crucifixion didn't establish the atonement. 4. No one who is free of the belief in scarcity could possibly make this mistake. So you first have to believe in the ego, that very limited perception, which is a belief in scarcity, in order to even believe this story of the crucifixion. 5. If the crucifixion is seen from an upside-down point of view, it does appear as if God permitted and even encouraged one of his sons to suffer because he was good. So this is the traditional point of view, the Christian point of view. But first, you must be viewing it from the ego, which is completely upside down, which has everything wrong. 6. This particularly unfortunate interpretation, which arose out of projection, has led many people to be bitterly afraid of God. So the guilt in our mind over the belief in separation calls for punishment. Guilt always calls for punishment. And that guilt then caused us to project it outside of ourselves and see it in this story of crucifixion. We think that if we project our guilt and our belief that we need to be punished for leaving God onto Jesus, then we are absolved, just like the crucifixion. So how can we not have a fear of God if he had his favorite son beaten? And it promotes this fearful idea because we know that we're certainly not his favorite son. What could possibly happen to me then? There's an underlying fear in this whole thought system that permeates our thinking as well. 7. Such anti-religious concepts enter into many religions. Such an interesting statement. Such anti-religious concepts enter into many religions. It's interesting that he uses the word anti-religious, and it would be blasphemous to Christians to say that they are being anti-religious if they believe the story, the traditional story of the crucifixion, or that God is a punishing God, that he actually did this. Yet that's what he's calling it here. He's saying it's an anti-religious concept. 8, yet the real Christian should pause and ask, how could this be? I like how he uses the word real. So you're not a real Christian if you believe that the story of the crucifixion is real and that God is a punishing God. Isn't that interesting? A real Christian, he says, pauses and reflects. And that's fascinating that a real Christian questions Christianity, pausing and thinking, how could this be? A real Christian, dare I say, thinks for him or herself. That seems to be what he's saying here. 9. Is it likely that God himself would be capable of the kind of thinking which his own words have clearly stated is unworthy of his Son? So he tells us over and over again that we are innocent children of God. So how could God be capable of thinking that we're guilty? That would mean that God would have to believe in guilt. And that's just utter nonsense. God is love. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Paragraph 2, sentence 1. The best defense, as always, is not to attack another's position, but rather to protect the truth. I really love this sentence. It goes against the teachings of the world or the ego, which is that the best defense involves exertion in some form. If we are attacked in the world, we attack back, and we call that defense. Here he's saying, you don't need any of that, just protect the truth. The truth doesn't need your defense. It needs nothing. You just need to protect that truth in your mind. Sentence 2, it is unwise to accept any concept if you have to invert a whole frame of reference in order to justify it. So when he says it's unwise to accept any concept, the concept being to justify attack. In order to justify attack, we have to then invert a whole frame of reference in order to justify it. We have to believe that we've separated from God, therefore we're separate from each other and separate from everything else, animals and plants, that we're guilty for doing so, and that we then deserve punishment, and that God is going to punish us, none of which is true. 3, this procedure is painful in its minor applications and genuinely tragic on a wider scale. So this procedure of thought is painful in our own individual lives and in the world on a mass scale. This whole concept that of attack and defense, that we've separated from God and each other, and that somebody could hurt us, whether it's another person or whether it's God, that we have to attack and defend ourselves. It shows up in our own individual lives, really just fear-based and not seeing people and everything and everyone as our brothers and sisters. And in the world, it shows up on a mass scale, like religious persecution. But it's not just that. It's any situation that's tragic like that, like slavery, the Holocaust, factory farming of animals, all of these things in which we think that we're separate from someone else and that their suffering doesn't matter. He's saying all of this whole crazy thought system is genuinely tragic. And it all stems from a fear of God. It all stems from this belief that we're going to be punished. And we don't think about that on a daily basis. It's in our subconscious, our unconscious mind. Most of us don't walk around thinking about the fear of God unless you are a Christian, probably, and you live in that fear of God, and you make daily choices out of a fear of God. But it's not just Christians who hold on to that fear. It's all of us. If we didn't have that fear, we would be at one with God. If we didn't have that fear, we wouldn't be seeking to project that guilt onto other people or other things. We wouldn't blame and attack and cause suffering. There would simply just be love. And what's interesting to me about this sentence, and what stands out to me the most about this sentence, is his choice of words. It's painful. It's genuinely tragic. This is very important to see here. Jesus is saying that the result of this type of thinking is genuinely tragic. And this actually goes against many sincere course students who tend to use the metaphysics of A Course in Miracles to say none of that matters. It's all an illusion. No, Jesus right here is saying actually it's really painful, and actually it's genuinely tragic. Of course, we know that on level 1, the level reality with a capital R, that none of this is true, that this is a dream that we just need to wake up from. But while we're in the dream, it's tragic and it's painful. 4, persecution frequently results in an attempt to justify the terrible misperception that God himself persecuted his own son on behalf of salvation. Again, these are really strong words. He's saying it's a terrible misperception. These are very strong words: painful, genuinely tragic, and terrible. And a lot of course students I've noticed tend to gloss over this language in the course. And there's a reason he's using these words. You know, some course students just see that everything is love and everything else is an illusion, and they think that, oh, it's a course in just love. But of course, in the introduction to A Course in Miracles, he says that this course doesn't aim to teach the meaning of love. It's about removing the barriers to the awareness of love's presence. And how can you remove those barriers without first looking at those barriers? You first need to see what kind of situations your ego has made. This is a course in really looking at your ego, looking at what's really happening here, the unconscious desires, very Freudian, that are projected in our own daily lives, on ourselves, that we do to ourselves, that we do to other people, that we do in the world. And there's a reason he's using these words. He's trying to get us to really see what we've made so that we can correct it. The idea of separation in our minds and the belief in a punishing God is tragic. It has led to everything that's wrong in the world. And again, it's not just Christians that have this belief, we do too. And as I've mentioned, it's often unconscious for course students or for atheists or people that agnostics, people who aren't really thinking about it, or, new agey spiritual people. We don't walk around with this belief of a fear of God, but he tells us over and over again that we do. We have this fear. We wouldn't have a fear of death. We wouldn't have a fear of growing old. We wouldn't have a fear of public speaking. We wouldn't have a fear of letting go of our addictions. We wouldn't have a fear of each other. We wouldn't have a fear of different people's belief systems. We wouldn't have a fear of natural disasters. We wouldn't have a fear of anything if we didn't have this unconscious, deep fear of God. We would return home. We would be at peace. We would be extending love in every moment. And getting back to this sentence, this idea of justifying the terrible misperception, we justify the misperception that God himself is punishing, because that's what the ego wants us to believe. The ego justifies it. The ego needs for us to believe in a punishing God. That way we won't return home. That whole belief sustains the illusion. That's why religion is so supported here in the world. In many ways, it sustains the dream of separation from God. The irony is that religion says that this is the way to God. But in some respects, and I'm not a person who bashes religion, I think there's a lot of good in religion. But in some respects, it's an ego trick, religion, to keep most people from finding God. And of course, this is just a general statement, but it's generally true. 5, the very words are meaningless. Okay, so let me go back and read that sentence so we know what he's talking about. Persecution frequently results in an attempt to justify the terrible misperception that God himself persecuted his own son on behalf of salvation. Sentence 5, the very words are meaningless. This whole thing is meaningless because it's not even true. 6, it has been particularly difficult to overcome this because although the error itself is no harder to correct than any other, many have been unwilling to give it up in view of its prominent value as a defense. All of this is a defense. He's saying it's not hard to give this idea up. It's just like any other ego idea. One isn't harder, remember, or bigger or smaller than any other ego idea. They're all just based in the idea of separation. So it's not hard to give up this idea, but we don't want to give up the idea. That's the problem. The ego is in love with this idea. And you know the old saying, love is blind. It's hard to get someone to see the truth when they're madly in love with a person or a concept. And this concept is a defense against God. That's why he's saying here in the end, many have been unwilling to give it up. So it's not hard to give up. They're just not willing to give it up in view of its prominent value as a defense. 7, in milder forms, a parent says, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," and feels exonerated in beating a child. So he's getting us to see how silly this whole concept is. And in truth, doesn't it really hurt the child more than it hurts the parent? This concept is hurting us. 8, can you believe our Father really thinks this way? Because of course it would be insane if God thought that way. 9. It is so essential that all such thinking be dispelled that we must be sure that nothing of this kind remains in your mind. This is an interesting sentence as well. He's saying all such thinking must be dispelled. We must be sure that nothing of this kind, all of these words he's using here are very strong words. He's saying we cannot leave a trace of this in your mind. So basically, the entire foundation of Christianity must be dispelled. If that entire foundation is based on this idea, what is he saying here? It's so essential that all such thinking be dispelled, that we must be sure that nothing of this kind remains in your mind. And even if you didn't go to church like me or weren't raised with religion in any way, we can't underestimate how this seeps into our unconscious. It's everywhere. We have to be, he's saying, quadruply sure that we've erased any associations with this type of thinking, meaning the type of thinking that believes that God is punishing, or we will never return home. There's no hope. And of course, we have to remember that A Course in Miracles is speaking to us. It's not speaking to Christians. And he's saying, you can't make it to God if you're still holding on to these old ideas. 10. I was not punished because you were bad. That's such a beautiful sentence. And it undermines all of Christianity, doesn't it? In that one sentence. And he rarely speaks in the first person, I was not punished because you were bad. 11. The holy benign lesson the atonement teaches is lost if it is tainted with this kind of distortion in any form. He's using the word benign as opposed to the harmful and violent interpretations of Christianity. The lesson of the atonement, that holy benign lesson, is that you are an innocent child of God and that God is love and we've never left him. And all of that, he's saying, is lost if this kind of distortion continues in any form in our mind. And that is the goal of the lessons of the workbook of A Course in Miracles, isn't it? The first half of the lessons are about undoing that fear in our mind. And the second half is about replacing that with the vision of the Holy Spirit. And I think we'll stop there for today. This section is pretty heady, and I think that these first two paragraphs give us enough to think about for the week. And if you would like to stay in touch with me, you can do so at the Facebook page, facebook.com/A Course in What, or my website, cynthiamorgan.us. There's also my hypnotherapy page on Facebook, /Cynthia Morgan Hypnotherapy. And we also have a phone number, which is 707-500-ACIW or 2249. And there you can leave a comment or ask a question. And again, I always love hearing from you. So thank you for listening today. And let's close with the summary of A Course in Miracles. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God.